Shin Megami Tensei V Vengeance is about as good as re-releases can get, in my opinion. More than just an excuse to release the same game again on new consoles with some basic quality of life features and the standard graphical and performance upgrades, SMT5 Vengeance also took the liberty to create an entirely new storyline that players can choose to follow at the beginning of a new playthrough. This new story, the Canon of Vengeance, follows the same overall structure as the original story, the Canon of Creation, but veers off into its own exclusive territory after a certain point. Having just finished 100%ing the game, I have some thoughts on the new story in the Canon of Vengeance. I've seen some refer to it as a masterful rewrite, or otherwise heap praise upon it, and while I do agree that the new story is better than the original in a lot of ways, I think some choices were made that leave a lot to be desired. I have seen some critiques of the game's story that I agree with, but I haven't seen one with my specific complaints yet, which is why I decided to make this video. Needless to say, if you haven't played through the original storyline and the new one, this video will contain spoilers for both. I'm going to go through the Canon of Vengeance storyline and point out the areas I think some poor decisions were made, and why I think those decisions were poor ones to make. So without further ado, let's get into it. In the original Canon of Creation, the basic idea behind the story comes to be a race for the throne of creation, which can only be ascended and its powers used by a Nahobino, which within the story of the game is a being created when a demon, which are explained as former gods who were forcefully parted from their knowledge, merges with a human who carries their knowledge. Humans acquired knowledge when Adam and Eve consumed the fruit of knowledge, which is where God stored all the knowledge he stole from the former gods, forcing them into becoming demons. Because of this, God instituted what was known as the Condemnation, a holy decree that forbade the existence of Nahobino to ensure that demons couldn't hunt down their knowledge in a human and forcefully fuse with them to become a Nahobino and challenge his rule. The story is truly kicked off when the protagonist and Aogami fuse to form a Nahobino, which can only happen because Lucifer rose to the throne and killed God during Armageddon 18 years before the events of the game, thereby releasing the condemnation and allowing the existence of Nahobino once again. The story is then pressed onward from that inciting incident as demons become aware that they can once again seek out their knowledge and make a bid for the throne and use its power to create a world of their choosing. If you listened to my explanation just now and thought that I'm leaving out everything having to do with the human characters, you've just become aware of one of the more basic issues the original Canon of Creation had in the conception of its story, which is to say that its human characters hardly mattered in the end and functioned as little more than plot devices to press forward the basic ideas I pointed out in that explanation. One of the things ostensibly addressed in the Canon of Vengeance is this very issue, with more effort having been put into fleshing out some of the characters so they aren't quite so one-note and flat. I used the word ostensibly here because in actuality, the only characters who really got any more characterization than before were Yuzuru and arguably Tao. Yuzuru has a few good moments where he's allowed to show a little more personality than before, and Tao gets a little more exposure and more of a personality by virtue of being more involved in the story than in the Canon of Creation. That being said, the other human characters in the plot, Sahori, Miyazu, and Ichiro, are just as underexposed as they previously were. Sahori still exists just to give Lamu a target, have her anti-bullying after-school PSA moment, and then be unceremoniously killed off, in a way far worse, more anticlimactic, and more half-assed than she originally was, I might add. Miyazu's connection to Kontsu is given a little more background and explanation, but otherwise she still exists solely as a damsel in distress character to be protected by first her brother, and then Kontsu with very little characterization or agency to herself. Ichiro gets a little more background behind his feelings of weakness and worthlessness by virtue of his conflict with Yuzuru, but other than that, he still just transitions instantaneously from being a knockoff, less cool Ryuji to being an asshat supreme, less cool Jimmy Hopkins in a single scene, but is also made into an even deeper hate sink of a character by having him summarily execute Yuzuru in this same scene on the flimsiest and most sudden of bases. I want to go a little deeper with Ichiro here, because he actually represents my first major issue with the new story of Vengeance, which is its dependence on the canon of creation in order to make sense. See, I was hoping that the canon of Vengeance would be a rewritten story that had the capability to stand on its own, like an enhanced retelling of the story told in the canon of creation. Unfortunately, it fails to do this and instead has a codependency with the canon of creation. It has plot points and elements that simply will not make sense to a player who is not familiar with the canon of creation storyline already. Ichiro represents this in spades by virtue of how close to all of his minimal character development is off-screened in the canon of Vengeance. In the canon of creation, Ichiro first approaches Abdiel in Shinagawa, which still happens in the canon of Vengeance with minimal difference, but following this, he approaches her again in Chiyoda and a third time in the Demon Lord's castle, all of which give him little tidbits where he can at least be seen aligning himself with Abdiel and making himself known to her. This ultimately culminates in his scene in Taito, where he discovers the corruptive properties of hair gel, which still feels quite forced and unearned in the original storyline, I will admit. Of course, in the canon of Vengeance, you end up going to Shinjuku with Tao and Yoko instead of going to Chiyoda, but the game makes it clear that all the events in Chiyoda continue to happen as they would have before, with some slight deviations. At one point, you get brought back to HQ to handle an issue with Miyazu being kidnapped by Konsu, and during this time, Ichiro mentions he'll be tagging along because there's a wall of fire blocking their advance on the Demon Lord's castle in Chiyoda, which of course refers to Cert, who acts as a mid-area boss of Chiyoda in the canon of creation. Following the Miyazu Konsu event, the protagonist, Tao and Yoko, return to Shinjuku, and Ichiro accompanies them for all of 10 minutes while they summon Mastema and talk to him. Mastema gives Ichiro the white stuff, and this apparently does something to him. This isn't exactly followed up on at all, but I think it's meant to imply something happens with Ichiro's personality when he then continues the campaign in Chiyoda with Abdiel. We later learn that Abdiel and her forces defeat the Demon Lord, Ariok, in the protagonist's stead, since at that point, he's a bit busy being betrayed by Yoko and damn near murdered by Lilith in Shinjuku so the Kadishtu can summon Tiamat. Due to this off-screening of all of Ichiro's events in Chiyoda, we never see him getting closer to Abdiel the way we do in the original game, which I will again reiterate, doesn't go very far even in that circumstance, but at least it was there at all. And it makes it clear that the writers figured the player would already be familiar with those events from having played the canon of creation, and so they could just leave it off screen, assuming the player would already know what to imagine had happened, like not having to show the audience Uncle Ben dying for the 5th time. Of course, because this was handled this way, there are knock-on effects from that point onward until the end of the game. Following this, the protagonist eventually makes his way to Taito, where the plot setup of having to gather the 3 keys to the Empyrean is repeated, but this time things are handled differently, since there was no pandemonic summit to result in Bethel's unity being shattered and the leaders of the various branches making a play for the throne. In this instance, Mastema asks you to ascend the throne because he assumes Yoko, having regained her form as a goddess, will try to destroy the throne with Tiamat. This completely destroys any sense the plot had from this point onward, as originally it made sense as to why the different branches of Bethel broke off with their leaders attempting to become Nahobino and reach the throne. But now, not only is this development not explained at all, but there's little reason for the branch leaders to be attempting to stop you from getting the keys if Mastema himself has asked you to reach the Empyrean. Moreover, when you first arrive, Tao mentions there being many Nahobino aspirants, which I guess could mean just random demons looking for their knowledge, but I took it to mean there's still the implication that the branch leaders are going to try and ascend the throne themselves, but now there's no explanation for this. In fact, when you confront Odin and Zeus, they talk to you like they're defending the keys for the sake of Bethel. I think the implication is supposed to be that in this timeline, because Abdiel defeated Ariok and projected strength to the other branches of Bethel, they remained loyal to her and so are defending the keys as members of Bethel. But again, why would they be doing that if Mastema himself asked you to ascend the throne? The angels in Shakan attacking you because word hasn't reached them yet that Mastema asked you to get involved there makes sense, but the idea of them just not having gotten the memo yet doesn't fly a second time. Of course, the simple doylist explanation for this is that they did things this way to reduce the amount of work that needed to be done in creating new assets or other content. They can just reuse Odin and Zeus and change their stats, which takes almost zero effort. It doesn't change anything about how much it makes the story crumble apart, though. I'd also like to add here that you can still face Shiva in the canon of Vengeance, and he still states that he's planning to destroy the universe and install a new one in its place, which now makes no sense, as again, the Bethel branch leaders haven't rebelled as far as we know. Also, this is literally Yoko's goal, so that seems like something that should have maybe been addressed as well. Skipping ahead to the Empyrean itself, there's now a new boss battle just before you enter, where you face Ichiro and Abdiel. This is the same point in the canon of creation, where Abdiel realizes she'll have to forego her loyalty to God's condemnation and become a Nahobito with Ichiro to defend his order for the world. And so she rejects her divinity as an angel and turns into fallen Abdiel. In Canon of Vengeance, she just shows up already in that form with damn near zero explanation. We get a line from Tsukiyomi being surprised at her new look, and Ichiro throws out one line about her having realized she couldn't defeat the protagonist on her own, which is pretty useless considering it's not clear what that means in this context, nor does it explain why she looks the way she does. And right after that, we just go into the fight and nuke the two of them and they're gone. Done and dusted. As a final addendum to this section about Canon of Vengeance being dependent upon Canon of Creation, I'd also like to point out how the concept of the Nahobino in general feels very orphaned in the Canon of Vengeance. In the Canon of Creation, they're very central to the story, and you end up clashing with the Nahobino forms of all the alignment representatives in the endings. This makes it feel like there's more of a focus on their existence and their importance to the plot, whereas in Vengeance, you literally only ever hear of potential other Nahobino and never actually see any other than the protagonist. To me, this shift in focus away from the importance of the Nahobino kind of made it feel to me like the whole idea was kind of an afterthought in the story of the Canon of Vengeance. In fact, it seemed like they went out of their way to kill off any of the other potential Nahobino in one way or another. It was to the point that throughout the Canon of Vengeance, I thought that Yoko was going to end up being some new god's knowledge, and them becoming a Nahobino to take the throne was going to lead to one of the two new endings. But nope, that wasn't right at all. In fact, that leads me to my next point. The most obvious new addition to the plot of Vengeance has got to be the girl whose hand you must take to select the Canon of Vengeance at the start of the game, Yoko. She is ever present throughout most of the route, and remains as a guest party member for pretty much the entirety of the first 60% of the game. Throughout this time, she interacts with the player and Tao, building up her character as a world-weary cynic with a dark past that has colored her view of the present and future. As I got to know more about Yoko as my first playthrough went on, I will admit that I didn't much care for her. I thought her arguments and viewpoints were excessively childish or reductive, leading me to find Tao's counterpoints far more mature despite them being more on the naive side. Yoko very much radiated this energy to me of a character who had something traumatic happen to them when they were younger, leading to them now being super selfish and wanting to tear down the world in an unshakable belief that it could never possibly get any better ever. I was looking forward to learning more about her past and coming to sympathize with her character once she eventually revealed the source of her trauma. Guess what never happened? Yoko seems like a truly magnificent misstep of a character to me, as her early writing sets up the possibility of quite an interesting, deep character, but the way her arc is completed just completely drops the ball and pisses all of that potential away. It turns out Yoko is just another creation goddess like Tao that was sealed away and for some reason was living as a human to infiltrate Bethel and set up a betrayal with the Kadishtu that would lead to her regaining her goddess license from the Bethel DMV, so she could then annihilate the world with Tiamat in an insane rampage of revenge against both God and the world he created. Hell, I think it would have been far superior had they diverged at the point that Tao rejoins the party when you head to Taito, and made it so that if you're aligned with Chaos at that point, Yoko shows up and joins you for that section of the game instead. It would have given them an opportunity to write in some more backstory-laden conversations with her throughout the section of the game and round out her character a bit more. But instead, she just completely disappears from the plot following Shakan and doesn't reappear until the very end of the game when your ending choice is locked in. There's a line somewhere in the game that mentions that she was a manifestation of her goddess self. But there's also a line somewhere that says she would be sent on increasingly dangerous missions by her superiors in hopes she'd be killed but always survive. These two things seem to be at odds with each other to me, unless the idea is supposed to be that the sealed goddess sent a manifestation of herself to be a human that was born and lived in the human world, waiting for the right moment to shoot her shot. But that's never confirmed, so might as well be headcanon. Honestly, I'm inclined to believe they just didn't consider her backstory much at all and ended up offering conflicting information. Either way, it makes me very sad that she had such potential to be an interesting character and then just turned into nothing more than hot semi-goth chaos goddess girl in the end. This last one is maybe going to be the most opinionated point I'm going to make, as I could easily see some people enjoying what I specifically do not. There are a few moments in Canon of Vengeance I can only think of to refer to as reactionary writing. Let me explain what I mean by this term. I've started using it to describe ongoing or living stories told in our modern age where the writers pay attention to what audiences are saying on the internet, and so write their story in reaction to what they see the audience saying. Think of things like TV shows, manga, and anime, where there is an ongoing story told in parts on some kind of regular basis, like weekly releases, for example. As each part goes out to the public, the creators can gauge the reaction in their audience via the internet. This doesn't have to just apply to these mediums, though. It can even apply to films now, if they're in an ongoing series or are stitched together with some kind of shared universe like with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It can also apply to video games, since games can easily meet these criteria at this point. There's no shortage of games in a franchise or series, or even live service games that receive regular updates to their story that could theoretically have their story written in response to the audience response to a previous entry. I would also like to add that I extend this term to include situations where a story is specifically written simply to subvert audience expectations, even if there's no specific audience reaction that is being responded to in the writing, although I suppose it would be better to classify that as a separate term, more like reaction fishing. You know when a little kid is telling a story and they say something and then pause, waiting to see if they get the reaction they want? Yeah, it reminds me of that. I bring this up because there are hints in the Canon of Vengeance story that there are moments in there specifically designed just to throw off players who are familiar with the Canon of Creation story and give them an I didn't see that coming moment, to subvert their expectations. For example, several of the new boss battles seem to be placed in the story at points meant to throw returning players off. Nama comes completely out of nowhere both times you fight her in places where there weren't even boss fights before. At least the second time, she takes the place of the first Lamu battle at Jozoji Temple, but it still happens sooner than returning players would expect. Lamu's boss fight now happens way sooner in the school. You fight Aishit once, leading you to believe you'll face her again at the end of Shinagawa like you did with Lamu, but then you end up with a Yuzuru Hayataro boss fight out of nowhere instead. I'll give a pass to the Konsu fight since it's at least in a newly added story section and doesn't literally just come out of nowhere, and obviously all the stuff in Shinjuku since it's a new area, so there's no expectations to play on. They do manage to squeeze the Yakumo fight into this part of the game again, but make it a duo fight against Nua as well, just as an excuse to let the player fight her human form since you only ever face her snake and Nahobino forms in the original. Then the game gets back on its shit again in Taito, having Saturnus show up where Zeus used to be, in throwing both Odin and Zeus at you together where Odin's boss fight originally happened. Then, the most egregious one I can think of, you go to confront Voski, he's just randomly offed by Beelzebub, and then you get to fight him instead. Well and truly just completely out of nowhere to surprise the audience. Of course, this continues when you reach the entrance to the Empyrean, as Ichiro and Abdiel drop in out of nowhere, again pretty much just creating a fight as an excuse to allow the player to face fallen Abdiel, since you only get to fight her Herald and Nahobino forms in the original game. Now, the reason I mentioned that I think this might be my most opinionated point is solely because I personally do not like writing flourishes like these. I don't think all of these are necessarily bad, per se. I like the opportunities to face new enemies and squeeze in fights that got skipped over in the original game, and of course, I'll take any chance I can get for new battle themes because all the music in this game is straight fire, but I never really seem to respond well to writing decisions that seem to be made solely in response to audience reaction or to specifically fish for a certain reaction, usually surprise, from the audience. This kind of reactionary writing, as I call it, has been on the rise in recent years, and I've been seeing it in things as early as The Last Jedi, where I thought a lot of the expectation-subverting gotcha moments were just not necessary and detracted from the story, and as recent as the newer chapters in the Jujutsu Kaisen manga, which I won't go into here to avoid spoiling anyone, but if you know, you know. I think I mainly reject these types of moments because it breaks my immersion and calls too much attention to the relationship between the creator and the audience for my tastes. It basically just throws in my face that I'm partaking in a fictional story being manipulated by someone to achieve specific ends, instead of just letting me experience and vibe along with the story. Not to mention, it makes me feel like instead of telling a story that they want to tell, or doing what's right for the story to make it as good as it can be, it shows that the creators of the story are instead just doing either what the audience wants, or specifically denying them what they want. It just feels unnatural and out of place. It's interesting just how much immersion can matter to a story. Like, we know it's fictional the whole time, and yet being able to suspend those disbeliefs and partake in the story as if it were real is so essential to the survival and success of the story. But I also admit that this varies from person to person, and so not everybody may agree with my personal take on this one. Some people may not be as put off by it as I am, and yet others still may even actually enjoy it. Speaking of which, I would like to close out this video by saying that I did really enjoy my time with Shin Megami Tensei V Vengeance, even more than I did my time with the original. I certainly didn't spend nearly 300 hours 100%ing it because I just couldn't stop hate playing it or out of spite or anything. Getting to experience this game again at a beautiful 4K 120 frames per second with all the horny mods and time-saving cheats I could possibly want with the freedom of playing on PC was a fantastic experience. That love, though, is why I critique, because I want the things I love to be the best they can possibly be. Critiquing things in hopes they continue to improve with each new iteration just makes sense to me. Hopefully you enjoyed this pseudo-review critique mini video essay thing. Feel free to drop a comment if you disagree with me and think this is the best game ever created by man, or drop one about whatever you want. If you did enjoy, make sure to like and subscribe as well so you can support the channel and see what else I put out. Probably something about anime, animation, or the next game I play. Until I see you next time, stay safe and have fun.